Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Nortenberg. I am the former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh and currently have the good fortune to serve both as chair of its Institute of Politics and director of its Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Institute and the Forum, and also on behalf of a distinguished list of co-sponsors, the Benedum Foundation, the University Honors College, Pitt School of Social Work, the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford, the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg, and the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. You were given the opportunity to submit questions when you registered, and many of you did. Though we will not have the time to deal with each of them individually, I will try to incorporate some of them into my conversation with our special guest, and will save a few to ask at the end. Let me also declare in advance to our speaker's father that I'm a father too, and so I will pay particular attention to your question. It is hard to move through any day without hearing or reading something about polarization in America, and more particularly about the rural-urban divide. Last December, Brookings published an article that took issue with much of what was being said and written. It began this way. In the week since Joe Biden was declared the winner of the 2020 presidential election, a familiar story of American politics has had plenty of time to fester. The narrative of two Americas, politically and economically divided into thriving urban places that went for Biden and hurting rural places that went for Donald Trump, destined by geography to a bleak future of polarization and discontent. This narrative presents two societies so fundamentally opposed, they barely belong in the same world. While this framing stems from real economic political trends, pundits, journalists, and policymakers have extrapolated these trends to fuel an urban versus rural narrative that is not only inaccurate, but harmful to our nation's collective political and economic future. Because both the Institute of Politics and the Thornburgh Forum care deeply about our collective political and economic future, we are proud to be presenting this program, which will focus on bridging the divide between rural and urban America. Our guest, Jen Giovannetti, is the president of the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. And when I give you a quick overview of her route to that position, you may quickly conclude that she is something of a human bridge herself. Jen grew up in an unincorporated area outside of Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania. In preparing for this program, I have learned that there are 10 or 12 definitions of rural. I feel quite comfortable in saying that the outskirts of Boiling Springs probably qualifies as rural under each of them. Apparently, Jen was looking for a change, as young people sometimes do, because she enrolled as an undergraduate here at Pitt on what definitely is an urban campus, and she earned her degree in planning and urban studies. She then became a graduate student at the University of British Columbia in the city of Vancouver, and through her graduate program became an international research fellow at Ho Chi Minh City, with her research being published through the Asian Urban Research Network. So her progression had taken her from an unincorporated location outside of Boiling Springs to Pittsburgh, to Vancouver, to Ho Chi Minh City. At this point, Jen's father-in-law, who also is viewing this program, and was her professor as director of Pitt's Urban Studies program, must have thought that he had won because everywhere Jen went and everything she did was urban. However, those early influences came back strong, and she spent nearly 20 years living and working in rural West Virginia and Virginia. Among other things, she directed the office of the Elkins Rail Yard redevelopment, served as CEO of the Randolph County Economic Redevelopment Authority, served as CEO of the West Virginia Wood Technology Center, and led community-based initiatives for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, focused on low-income communities and advancing strategies for community investment, including the creation of the West Virginia Loan Fund Collaborative. So Jen, let me start with a straightforward question. Which side are you on? Are you on the urban team or the rural team? Are you with your father or your father-in-law, or do you refuse to see things in such adversarial terms?
I think the latter. I refuse to see things in such adversarial terms. You know, I think the beauty of having the experience of living and working in both rural and deeply urban places has just developed a greater appreciation for community for me. And maybe it is a testament to my education at the University of Pittsburgh that I am a community planner at heart and find endless ways to be fascinated by both urban and rural places.
Well, and in some ways it would be even harder to categorize you today because you are the president of the Benedum Foundation, which is headquartered here in Pittsburgh, but it is a place-based funder with a dedication to rural communities, mainly in West Virginia, but also in southwestern Pennsylvania. I know because I've been there that the Benedum story is captured in the language that is framed on the boardroom wall behind you. Can you tell us a little bit of that and how it is that the foundation came to be so committed to West Virginia in particular?
Yeah, thanks for noticing that, Mark. On the wall back here is the words of Michael Benedum. And they're very special to me, the staff, anyone who's worked at the foundation, and the trustees, because it's a reflection of how he was really thinking about equity and what his personal wealth meant to him, which honestly was put into a real context on the wall behind us, that if you can't give this back and help people help themselves, you've really lost a great opportunity in life. The West Virginia piece is interesting, and Benedum is just a dream job for me because the interesting urban work we do in Pittsburgh, but because the base mission as a place-based funder is very, very rural, and not many foundations have this type of dedicated place-based mission. Michael Benedum captured it really nicely. And if you don't mind, I just want to sort of put it in his words. I grabbed a part of the codicil that is behind me. And the way he thought about it, he wrote, "I cannot close my eyes to the realistic consideration that Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania abound in riches, having a citizenship in which men of great wealth are more common than rare. West Virginia is in a less fortunate position. There can be no question but that its needs are much greater than those of my adopted home. Consequently, in making specific provisions for West Virginia institutions, I have done so in good conscience, with a sense of equity and with recognition of a responsibility to distribute my estate in a way that will bring the greatest good to the greatest number." And we live by that today. We really distribute 2/3 of the Benedum grants each year to West Virginia and 1/3 to Pennsylvania.
Well, it is a wonderful legacy, and it must make you and others at the foundation feel great to be carrying it on after all of these years. On more than one occasion, Pittsburgh has been named America's most livable city. And I know you like it here. But I also know that you think there are special benefits that come from living in less urban communities. Can you talk about some of that for us?
Yeah, when you started with the quote from the Brookings report, it's really, I think, a pity and a lost opportunity that we are talking about the negative sides and sort of pointing fingers between citizens that live in cities and citizens that live in more rural places. It's clear that we really depend on each other in so many ways. The rural communities are, growing our food and have been producing a lot of our energy and making many of the things that we live on. But for me, having lived in a small mountain town in West Virginia was pretty life-changing because I saw a different type of community that I don't believe I had really experienced before. So people ask, why would you live in a small town in West Virginia, or why would you live in a small town in Iowa, or this sort of like stereotype that we like to perpetuate in America. And, when I think about Elkins, West Virginia, I think that there are kind of three buckets that provide this intrinsic value for people that doesn't get talked about enough. One is the environmental legacy and the opportunity to live in a much more natural setting. Elkins, as an example, and much of the towns in West Virginia are just on the doorstep of beautiful, beautiful places. We were at the base of the Monongahela National Forest, but West Virginia is a headwater state. It is the birthplace of rivers. It is an unbelievably stunning place, and it contains some of the greatest biodiversity hotspots in all of North America. That is an absolute pleasure to be near on a day-to-day basis. When you live in West Virginia, you don't go home and watch TV. You really have so much that's drawing you into this natural environment. So that's one. The other, I think, for many people, not for me particularly, but there's a connection to history and homesteads. People have owned land in these places, these rural communities across America for generations. And I don't think we should disparage people's honoring their family history and sort of the importance of homesteads for people and the families, generations of families that have owned them. But the final one is this intangible idea of community. And I know we all think we've got community, and we do in many different ways. It takes so many shapes. But in a small town, in a state like West Virginia, community is a very special and palpable thing. You can't go to the grocery store, the gas station, or the movie theater without seeing people you know. You can't be at a little league game or a soccer game without knowing every parent and every kid there. It's a place where people share, where they barter, where they show up at people's houses to deliver food. They take care of one another. And there is a real sense of you matter in ways that I think are hard to know unless you've lived or worked in a place like I feel I did in Elkins, West Virginia. Professionally, I think my work, when I look back on my career, the work that was so challenging but so aspirational in a small town like Elkins is some of the most fulfilling work I will ever do. It was meaningful. It was meaningful to me, to the community, restoring historic buildings, replacing structures, bringing businesses into the community, being part of something that everyone is sharing in and that you feel is to the benefit of a broader community was really fulfilling to me. And I think that's the special part of living in a rural place. And this was a time in my life when we were raising our three kids, and it's a different type of upbringing for a child. And this is another thing that I don't think we share enough about rural upbringings. These are unfenced children. We felt like, your dogs and your kids in your community all intermixed with each other. Kids are climbing trees. They are building fairy houses under trees. They are mucking through streams. I think this is a really great way to be a child and to test one's limits and to fail and to explore and to learn. And I would also say that I personally believe this is why West Virginia has developed some of the most interesting Americans that have come out of history. We've had out of the state of West Virginia just some phenomenal people that have changed the world. One of my favorite books of all time is The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. She was the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1938. That book also won the Pulitzer Prize in the early 30s. She grew up in the smallest town you could imagine in West Virginia. There are great explorers like Chuck Yeager, who was the first human to break the sound barrier, a test pilot and brave and exciting human being who we just, I think, lost last year. And, Mark, you and I have talked about some of the great technology leaders right now that have come out and that are leading it at the CEO level. John Chambers of Cisco, Brad Smith of Intuit. I could go on and on. Booker T. Washington was born in a slave hut in Virginia, and after emancipation, moved to Malden, West Virginia. They were so poor, he was working in a salt furnace at age 9. When he rose out of that and was able to go to Hampton University, he still went back to Malden, West Virginia to teach the kids and the adults out of a small school before he went on to be one of the most prominent African-American leaders of his time. There's just a lot to be said for, I think, the character and the opportunities and the sort of innovative upbringings that kids have in West Virginia and what they do with that as it builds their human capital on a bigger stage.
Well, and Pittsburgh has benefited directly from that too. We most often talk about the transformation from the Steel City to the Knowledge City, and we talk about the eds and meds. But there's another sector that is very strong in our economy, and that is professional services. And there are two guys who grew up in the same neighborhood in West Virginia who came to Pittsburgh and each became the managing partner of a large Pittsburgh firm. Peter Kalis at what became K&L Gates and Greg Jordan at what is Reed Smith. And they started out as the managing partners, and by the time they were done, they were the global managing partners because they had built two of the largest law firms in the world. And there's no reason today that Pittsburgh should be the home to two of the largest law firms in the world, except for the talent and the drive of those two guys. But one of the things that is interesting when we talk about these examples is that there clearly are limits to what you can do in a rural community. And that has been true for a long, long time. So Chuck Yeager, if he wanted to be a test pilot, couldn't stay in West Virginia. And John Chambers, if he wanted to be the CEO of Cisco, couldn't stay in West Virginia. Another name, if Chuck Vest wanted to be the president of MIT, he couldn't stay in West Virginia. And of course, the choices really aren't binary because there are towns and there are towns, and there are cities and there are cities, and there are things that you can't do in Pittsburgh either. And if they're what you want to do, you may have to go to New York or Washington or Chicago or Los Angeles. So how is the plight of rural residents different today? Have their choices become more limited?
Yeah, I think the job piece is a good one because this is part of the story about migration too, where, you know, for job seekers, especially seekers that want a variety of choice, it makes sense to move to higher populated places. You know, we certainly have our CEOs. We have our hospital CEOs, our presidents of universities and colleges. We have, you know, any number of high performing folks that have stayed in the state. You mentioned Reed Smith, you know, great thinkers, lawyers, academics, and others that have found the job that suits them and that is their best job and their dream job in West Virginia. But the larger dilemma of having choice and having a diversification of industries where people can live and work in West Virginia does create, you know, less opportunity. And this is maybe a great place to even bring up this stereotype of coal mining, where, you know, coal mining jobs are a job that is higher paid, and you can support a family comfortably off of it. For better or for worse, it's high risk, but you can do that. And those jobs have continued to shrink with mechanization and other natural reasons. But that's the rationale. You can still live in the place you love and have a job that's a wage sustaining job for a family. And that is where I think the aspiration to have more of that in our rural communities is something that drives, you know, me every day. I think that the knowledge economy and the shift to where job change is going to provide different opportunities is still a way for a state like West Virginia and other rural communities to capture some of that. That's going to happen through technology with remote work and telework. I think that's going to happen with people wanting to live in places where they can recreate and be closer to nature and will potentially bring new businesses into these communities. And Mark, as we've talked about, I think there's an intentional way that we've seen you can land institutions and facilities in a state like West Virginia and attract very unique jobs like the Green Bank Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia, which has radio telescopes that are, you know, phenomenal and attract people specifically for that equipment. And these are, you know, PhD and high scientific jobs.
You know, there was an article, of course, you know, you were in it. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that was titled, "West Virginia has everybody's attention. What does it really need?" You were identified in that article as the president of the largest donor in West Virginia of any private foundation. And this is what you said. Resources, all resources tend to flow to places of density. I'm talking about philanthropic density, population density, institutional density. All of that money tends to cluster there. Can you say a little bit more about that concept?
Yeah, it's this feeling and idea that there's a density and a resource bias that happens when cities become the place that investors feel is maybe the highest and best place for their money, or the least risky place for their money, or just has more other sticky components that help build amass more outcomes for the investments that they make. But this is a problem for rural communities. Right now, you know, only 7% of the US Foundation dollars go to rural communities, and this includes universities and hospitals. A study that was done from 2010 to 2014 looked at per capita philanthropic dollars, and it showed, I want to be sure I get this right, it showed that in the Black Belt, for example, and the Mississippi Delta, there was only $41 per capita of philanthropic dollars. In coal country and low country, that would include a place like West Virginia, it's $43. While nationally, that number per capita is $451. If you now leapfrog over to cities, in a city like New York, it's $2,000 per person and closer to $4,000 in a city the size of San Francisco. So this is leveling out for population. These are per capita numbers, but I'll pick on my own sector. This goes to show that the way those dollars flow has a bias towards cities and is creating its own level of disparity and probably not seeking opportunities that exist in rural places that could have, just as successful of outcomes.
So I'm going to ask you a question in the way it was put to me as it was submitted. This member of the audience said, the shift of population from rural America to urbanized places has been going on for decades. Many communities in rural areas were established as the result of an economy that no longer exists. What is your response to those who might say that declining rural communities are simply undergoing a natural selection process and that trying to save them is a pipe dream? That sounds kind of heartless. That's not my language.
I'd like to know the economist that wrote that question. I'd like to step back and take a pretty broad swipe at this question and say, I think we are always in a cycle of population mobility into, different places. From the earliest settlement of the U.S., where land was being given away to encourage pioneers to go west and forge off of the coast into the more undeveloped and dangerous parts of the United States, to the clustering back into cities during industrialization when the jobs were there, and dangerous as they were, people felt very sure they could get a job and came back at the turn of the century to our cities. But the cities became so polluted, there was a desire to get back out into the country or into the, at least the suburban parts of the outer ring of the urban areas for health benefits, to today. And then it makes me think, well, if we project 30 to 50 years ahead from today, as these cycles and churn continues to move, I just don't think it's as static as that question may be asking for me. I can imagine a future where sea level rise is forcing populations out of our East and West Coast cities. I can see a time where high fire and burn parts of the country are not primed for residential expansion and people are moving to other parts of the country. The areas of the US that are flood prone, I could see population shifting again. And I guess the question is, how do we create the optimal scenario for the urban and the rural divide to actually create a more seamless transition for how people thrive and how wealth is shared and smaller and larger economies work in simpatico in ways that we're not quite seeing right now.
So what are some of the key strategies that you and others at the Benedum Foundation are pursuing as you try to deal with some of these disparities and with the issue of density?
Yeah, so I think it is, it's the battle of trying to create a level playing field in the places where this resource bias is pulling resources away from our small towns and rural communities. There are ways we do it at Benedum by really trying to lift up and expand intermediaries. Some of those, these are all, when I say intermediary too, I'm talking about locally driven groups that have local leaders, this proximate leader piece where in healthcare, there are systems that are just have gaps in them so that access for people is very difficult. We've got a West Virginia Primary Care Association that does a great job to try to create that density and expand for regional health centers. We've got a network of FQHCs, these federally qualified healthcare centers. We're trying to connect and bridge and lift sort of them up as a system. We do a similar thing with education. We had a great strategy that we've had for years and continue to feel is really successful in helping the philanthropic intermediary connect more community foundations and create more community foundations so wealth can be generated, kept, grown, and empowered in very small population areas. So these are the ways we've been doing it with intermediaries, but I think that philanthropy is a great source of funds to take riskier, what would be seen as riskier investments where things have been not tried yet and not proven. And we're a great source of funds to let proximate leaders and others, nonprofits and folks that really have great ideas and innovations that are coming out of rural places to try these ideas and try to do things differently. And we see a lot of innovation and bold actions that we are able to invest in West Virginia on the individual level, but then also on these systems levels.
So in terms of the size of the problem, this issue of density and the huge disparities that you described earlier, clearly as generous and as focused as you are, you can't do it yourself. So here is your father's question. What can the federal government do to help us bridge this divide?
Well, thanks, Dad. The federal government is such a critical source of funds. I'm really excited about the announcement from the Biden administration on really taking a bold step towards thinking about how do we really flow catalytic capital into American infrastructure. Broadband is becoming one of the equity issues of our time, I think, between urban and rural communities. Broadband is essential to educational progress, health access, small business growth and development, remote work. It's essential to so many things that that federal funding that could really be a shot in the arm to rural communities for broadband and the advanced technologies, I think is a big one. But I think to really be impactful, it's more than just money. The way we've been treating federal funds and the grant application still disadvantages and creates a continuous disinvestment in rural communities. It's hard for rural communities to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes, which is needed in cash match just to get federal grants. I think that a set aside or some really specific strategy that's thoughtful and different and rethinks the way we flow federal dollars from all the agencies, EDA, USDA, DOE, all of them would benefit rural communities and create a more equitable distribution of those grant dollars because right now it's a competition scenario, just like Michael Benedum wrote in his own words. There's just a competitive disadvantage for rural communities. And I think if we don't address federal grants and the grant making process differently, we're going to keep getting what we've been getting. And that's a slow disinvestment, creating these sort of anemic places for federal funds.
Well, I want to go back to access to high-speed internet for a moment, because one of the great champions of this cause, the president of Pitt Johnstown, is in the audience tonight. And a couple of years ago, he wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post arguing that if we want to close America's rural-urban divide, digital infrastructure is a key. And just 2 days ago, he followed up with an op-ed declaring that Biden's next big deal must include expanded broadband access. I can't figure out why we haven't already done this. And I'd like to confirm with you if it's true that this is a part of the Biden infrastructure package.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the president of Pitt Johnstown after having the chance to have dinner with him at an event a year or two ago. And I appreciate so much the way he verbalized that need and the fact that if the funds can't come in a way that can help rural places catch up and really invest in this kind of transitional movement, then we're going to continue to lose ground. And it's going to affect hospitals and clinics. Telehealth is going to be an essential part of billing and service in the future. It's going to affect the quality and the opportunities of the way education might roll out differently, like the future of education. And it's certainly going to affect business because e-commerce is front and center to everything. But it's also going to, I think one of the opportunities for a state like West Virginia is more remote workers. And with high-speed broadband, where you can have the upload and download speeds to really work any job from anywhere, that would be important. Now, how this actually comes through the Biden plan and is equitably distributed through communities of opportunity is yet to be seen, because the competition will be very stiff. I lived 20 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia, the state capital, and I had terrible broadband even in a state like that when I was so close to the capital. So I think it's a problem across the nation, and it's going to require really just a lot of federal intervention,
which we have done in the past as a country. With electricity when that was the clear need. And I think the point you made about remote work is very interesting, because in some ways, the pandemic has made even more visible the digital divide. At the same time as companies and universities and other organizations have had to really become to rely on remote working. They had no choice. We're seeing how well it can work. And so perhaps there is no reason that someone in Elkins, West Virginia couldn't have the kind of job that you were describing before, a family sustaining job. By being employed in Pittsburgh or Washington or Philadelphia or in any of a number of places.
Yeah, and I think we will start to see some pushback on the employee side of realizing that this is possible, and on the employer side, as there's just so many assets that are owned and operated right now that could probably be streamlined differently. But rural communities aren't for everyone, but I think that there's probably more of an appetite for people to try it out or to live there. And when that does happen and you have a remote opportunity and you can relocate to a rural state, you bring with you a lot of ancillary effects of that. Spending and leadership and community engagement and all of the things that can really evolve communities in ways that we've not seen right now.
Are there any other things in the infrastructure plan, as you understand it, that would be particularly important for either West Virginia or southwestern Pennsylvania?
Well, I am very I'm very interested in tracking and seeing what actually comes out on the other end of the legislation, if it makes it through, around the transition to green energy jobs. The types of jobs that I think are in the pipeline for the future that might relate to solar installation and solar panel construction, parts and maintenance for wind power, electric vehicle parts and charging stations and the types of technology related to electric cars, I think is an opportunity for a state like West Virginia, where people are hardworking and excellent at making things. So I think that there could be shifts that could really bring jobs to a state like West Virginia, because the manufacturing culture is very strong there. And the link to other energy sector jobs and moving that into green energy, if the price point and wages can really keep up with the shift to green energy, as the Biden administration really seems to communicate, that would be an opportunity for many of our rural communities. I think it's just an opportunity as well to shift our mindset to think about some of the legacy impacts of other energy pieces. I know that we've been sort of tracking and thinking about jobs that could be related to even capping abandoned and orphaned gas wells around the region. That's a job that is, really important and could help not only mitigate some of the impacts of abandoned wells, but would be in alignment with the folks that already work in that industry and that are looking for additional ways to use their skills.
Well, one thing that seems clear is that even if globalization and free trade and particular trade agreements were broadly beneficial to the greater good, the costs were borne disproportionately by particular people who lost their jobs. And that includes people who thought they had the American dream, and suddenly it was snatched from them. One of the things that candidate Biden said on the campaign trail suggested that places like the places you're describing, where there has been a disproportionate hit, and may still be, could recover through some of these green jobs. And the specific statement I remember is, and you won't have to move to California in order to take one of these jobs. And do you think that something like that could work, that you think of yourself as a place-based philanthropy, that there could be very deliberate attempts to locate jobs in regions that have been disadvantaged?
Yeah, I think what we need is an intentional approach to that and trying to do that. I think what we learned, for better or for worse, from earmarks of the past is that facilities could be put into places that were not the first choice. We have a phenomenal FBI center in West Virginia. I mentioned the Green Bank Observatory. The NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has a supercomputer in Fairmont, West Virginia, that is a great opportunity to see the type of weather and climate change data be more accessible to spin-off businesses. I mean, there's a huge industry in insurance and technology around weather, and it is part of the future. So those are intentional decisions to put those types of highly sophisticated facilities and jobs in a rural community, and they've been successful. They grow. So I think it takes the type of open-minded and intentionality that rural places deserve, so that we can not only disperse opportunity, but create new opportunities off of these types of endeavors.
And you said earlier, when you were talking, I think, about the supercomputer, that it becomes a magnet that brings talent into the state. But I know from visiting the West Virginia University campus that the location of the FBI center that you were talking about had led to a ramping up of programs that were forensics related, that we're also preparing young people in West Virginia to take advantage of the jobs that people knew were going to be there in the future because there was this anchor facility. Well, you know, we've been talking mainly about economic issues, but one area of great interest to the registrants was the need to foster more effective communications and respectful human connections so that we could begin to recognize what we have in common and not simply be focused on the things that seem to keep us apart. Do you have any guidance to share in terms of bridging divides in this more human sense, including how to resist the attempts that we have seen by some politicians and some media outlets to keep us divided for their own purposes?
Yeah, I was so happy that there were questions that arose around this because this is the civic engagement piece. This is the piece that I think we all have a responsibility to not make assumptions or not perpetuate these stereotypes that rural America is poor, white, and red. I think that's wrong. And I think that we have a mutual flow back and forth between cities and the outer rings of cities and rural communities. And if we have to just, I don't know if there's one big communication blitz about it, but I think the more people recreate and take weekend trips to the small towns and really meet people and understand the kindness and the humor and the beauty of other places, whether that's as far away as Ho Chi Minh City or a small town like Elkins, West Virginia, I think this is where people begin to act differently. But if we can't appreciate each other, we are basically undermining other people's human capital, and we are prejudging place before giving an opportunity for economies to thrive and for communities to grow.
Well, how much do you think, as someone who lives in both worlds, we have to overcome? Another member of the audience said, you know, can we really bridge the rural-urban divide when the wealth gap continues to grow and seems to include a new billionaire every day, either on one of the coasts or in Texas? How real is the resentment? Because the differences flow both ways. You know, urban people can go into rural areas for a range of reasons and come away with impressions that kind of burst the stereotypes that they have been prisoners to. But what about the other direction? Is there a level of resentment that is accurately reflected in much of what we read?
You know, Mark, you know, in talking to me, I'm really big on two things. How do we help capital flow more easily to these disinvested places? And how do we give people more agency? And what's been happening over, I think, the last, I don't know how many years is as educational disparities grow, as economic disparities grow, as health outcomes and health disparities grow, the people in the places that are on the losing end of that access do feel like they're losing agency. They're losing control over their own destiny. They're losing choice. And they're rightfully so seeing the structural outcome of this like disinvestment, this slow disinvestment. So I think it's justified if you're on the side where you begin to see these diminishing investments, because the opportunities are still there, but we've started to get to a place where, again, the resource bias and the wealth bias is starting to create such an imbalance that it's frustrating to people.
And just to focus in on a couple of things that you mentioned, are you saying that there are educational disparities and healthcare disparities that do exist today and that need to be effectively addressed?
Yes, West Virginia has lower educational attainment than its surrounding peers. It has some of the highest rates of chronic disease and disease of despair. And much of this is related to legacy issues and poverty. So that scenario right there is bad for America. It's bad for democracy. It's bad for human capital. And we should all care about that.
So what do you do if you're a parent today and you hope naturally for the best for your children? And in some ways, the best is to provide them with an education that probably is going to lead them to leave. And in terms of close-knit communities and family legacies, you really want them to stay. How do parents deal with those choices?
Yeah, it's so tough. I wouldn't, dare advise sort of parents on that personal level, because, the children are the most important thing we have and invest in our lives. But this is a troubling issue where you see such outmigration of kids that don't stay in their communities. They do leave, and sometimes don't come back, or don't come back for a while. And that it's such a personal and it's such a personal choice. But I think that it's in everyone's best interest to allow a more fluid way that opportunity can get to rural places, so that things like remote work or starting your own business in a rural community, that there are opportunities in the future that don't exist as readily as they do now. This is more access to banking resources, more access to technology and broadband, more access to being able to collaborate with other entrepreneurs. These are things that people in West Virginia and many of the really high-performing nonprofits that we work with are working on. There are strategies that are really dedicated to this. And I know the state of West Virginia takes these things very seriously and is progressing, these strategies as well. It would be really helpful, though, to create a future where if kids do leave to go to university, they can boomerang back. I know that boomerang concept is big here in Pittsburgh too, to see people, that have, like myself, that started out here and, boomeranged back years later, happily so. So what we're not seeing enough is the boomerang effect to allow that to people to gain human capital, gain their skills, build their education, build their experience, and happily come back and use that in the state of West Virginia. But I'd also say it was formative for me to move to West Virginia in my late 20s. This was in a very dynamic part of my career. I think I learned everything I needed to learn about what I wanted to do career-wise and how I wanted to use my skills by working the job I did in West Virginia.
Well, you made an interesting comparison when you talked about the boomerang effect in Pittsburgh, because, of course, it wasn't that long ago, in the mid-'80s, that the steel industry collapsed, that manufacturing was heading in the wrong direction, when unemployment in the greater Pittsburgh area was close to 20%. And for a lot of years, after that, there just weren't opportunities for young people. And there were a lot of young people who would have, as their first choice, stayed if they could have found a roughly comparable professional opportunity in this region. They couldn't, they left. And then many of them did come back, both because they thought, well, Pittsburgh would be a great place to raise a family, and because the economy had really been transformed. And so suddenly there were opportunities for them.
And the cost of being sort of drawn to those high-resourced cities is also a higher cost of life, a higher cost of living. So if you think about, a hybrid future where you have a high-paying, fulfilling job and you can sort of interact with the city, but you can live in a place that is more cost-effective with more community, or even more access to natural resources for someone like me who really appreciates that, then you end up having a hybrid society that creates, the best of both worlds for the people that want that.
Well, I was smiling inside earlier in our conversation when you began referencing climate change and what that may say about the places people choose to live, because just a couple of days ago, my brother texted me a long article dealing with that topic, and it focused mainly on the work of a professor at Tulane who had studied the movements of people and the ways in which they likely were going to respond to climate risk. That is, where do you go if you want to get away from fires or floods or these terrible storms? And in a general way, the advice given was consistent with your earlier message. That is, the Great Lakes region, the Rust Belt, were places that seemed to be more insulated from those risks than other parts of the country. But then this scholar really focused in, and I couldn't believe it. He ended up saying, the place you ought to go is Duluth, Minnesota, which was my hometown.
Maybe you'll boomerang back there.
And he was rattling off the things that influence this choice, an abundant water supply and forward thinking with respect to things like energy and lots of parks and good health care and affordable housing. He even referred to a coolness factor that led somebody to label Duluth the San Francisco of the North, a label that I had never heard before. Then the author of this article decided that he was going to make a site visit. And this is what he said. I'm not going to sugarcoat my first impression. Driving into town, Duluth struck me like a Midwestern version of Pittsburgh. I took that as a huge compliment. I'm quite certain that is not the way that it was intended, but it did lead me to think that whether we're talking about the outskirts of Boiling Springs or Elkins, West Virginia, or Pittsburgh, or even Duluth, there really is a lot more that we have in common than the differences that seem to separate us. So if we all do what we can to bridge this divide and some of the other divides that exist in American life today, it will be really good for all of us. And so, Jen, I want to thank you not only for being here tonight and for giving us so much to think about, but for everything that you do day in and day out to try to build these bridges that ultimately are going to be very important if we want to advance the collective good. So thank you very much.
I appreciate the invite. And I don't know, I'm surprised you could find the absolute perfect quote to tie all of this together for us to think differently about what the future really holds and how we may be engaging in rural communities in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years as the globe changes. So
Well, change will come. We know that, and we can help make it good change rather than bad change. And that's what we all should be focused on. So again, thanks to you, thanks to your father, thanks to your father-in-law, thanks to the chair of your board who sent in a question. And I do want to say thanks not only to those three members of the audience and the UPJ president, but to all of you for being here. We don't have a firm deal or date lined up, but I expect that our next program probably will feature Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto talking about the Marshall Plan for Middle America, which will be a natural extension of this conversation. So we hope you'll be able to join us then. And thanks again, Jen. It's been a real pleasure.
thank you.